Okay, this is our session on producing and deploying HEVC. And this is our agenda. And I just wanted to catch you up on where HEVC was. And then we'll talk about the encoding side, towards the end. And the HEVC is it's a patent encumbered technology, so you have to pay royalties to use it. And the royalty situation, when we talked here last year, the royalty situation seemed pretty well in place. Everything, was going to cost you, but it wasn't going to cost you that much. And if you were a content producer, it wasn't going to cost you anything. And then HEVC Advance came in, and we'll look at what they proposed. And then there's even rumors of a third patent pool coming out. So HEVC, I think it's been a huge step backwards this year. What we know is that MPEG-LA, this was the first patent group, and their proposed royalty structure was, actually it's not proposed, this is what they're charging. It's 20 cents per encoder or decoder with a de minimis exception of 100,000. So if you're building your own encoder, you're creating your own player for in-house HEVC playback, as long as you don't exceed 100,000 units, you don't have to pay anything. And there is a $25 million annual cap. So if you're Apple and you're paying 20 cents a unit for your iPhones, it stops at 25 million. And that also is, that's pretty nice, because if you're Apple, that gives you the ability to say, okay, we're going to pay 25 million. We can put it in all the iPhones, all the iPads. We can put it in Safari. We can put it in the Macs. So basically, it's once you reach that cap, you can put it anywhere. So you look at the companies who are going to reach the maximum, and companies like Google can do the same thing. We can put HEVC decode in all our Chromecast units. We can put it in Chrome itself. We can put it in Android, that we sell. Because, of course, the OEMs that sell Android phones are going to pay the royalty, not Google. But if Google sells a device with HEVC in it, they pay. And there's no royalty for content, which was kind of a big deal, because there is a royalty for H.264 in content. So if you sell pay-per-view or subscription-based H.264 encoded content, you owe MPEG-LA royalty. So very surprising when MPEG-LA came out with the HEVC royalty structure and didn't charge a content royalty. But HEVC Advance took care of that. So HEVC Advance is a group led by GE, and they've got Technicolor and Dolby and a few other companies in it, including GE. And they came out with a royalty structure of 80 cents per device. And so the royalty structure from their press release / royalty PDF is on the right, and I kind of pulled from the information on the left. So if you're selling a mobile phone, it's 80 cents a unit. If you're selling a TV, it's $1.50. Other devices, and this is what really stings, other devices includes browsers, and that's $1.10. So if you're Chrome, if you're Google and you're shipping Chrome, every browser somebody downloads, there's a cash register in the back that, cha-ching, 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 $1. So, and there is no cap. So that's a huge deal. And really, I ran the numbers for an article I wrote, and looking at iPhone 6 sales, which was the first Apple device that had HEVC, it looked like Apple was going to have to write a check for like $120 million. And that's a big number, even if you've got $16 billion in the bank. And then what a lot of people really complained about was the content royalty. So the content royalty is 0.5% of attributable revenues. So if you're MGO and you rent a movie for $4 and it's HEVC encoded, then you've got to pay 20 cents. Is that 20 cents? Whatever the number is. I'm bad with math. But you got to pay 0.5% of that $4 to HEVC Advance. So this came out, they announced their formation in April. They came out with their royalty structure in June, and everybody got upset. It was a big deal. But even worse is that there's a third pool out there And there are some pretty significant companies who aren't in either IP pool. So everybody's talked, not everybody, there's a few people like Dan Rayburn who writes for streaming media. He's one of our VPs. He's tracking a third pool that has other content holders who may come out, and of course if they come out with a royalty structure, then there may be a third royalty. So all of a sudden HEVC Advance went from a pretty manageable number, or HEVC, pretty manageable number, to these kind of numbers. So this is the annual implications of the HEVC Advance proposed royalty. So Apple, they've got more than 3, but at least 3 products that would be affected by it. Before HEVC Advance, they would pay MPEG LA $25 million. After HEVC Advance, as I said, it would be hundreds of millions. With Google, they've got Chrome, they've got Android devices sold by Google, they've got OTT devices. Again, they go from 25 million to potentially billions. And then you can see the numbers for the other companies. Interestingly, Microsoft Edge, which is the browser that succeeds Internet Explorer 11 on the Windows 10 platform, it originally had HEVC decode, then they took it out, and now apparently it's back in. So it's the only browser I'm aware of that's got HEVC decode, which is either Microsoft knows something that we don't, or they're going to end up paying just a fortune. Because it's, they're giving away Windows 10 for free. They said that hundreds of millions of people have downloaded it. So I mean, they're going to pay $1.10 to HEVC Advance for each one of those. So I mean, anyway, this really upset the apple cart. If you look at Amazon, they're not only on the hook for the hardware, they're on the hook for the content. And that's a big deal. And Netflix, Major League Baseball, they were owing nothing under HEVC Advance and tens of millions after. So Netflix in particular, they're using HEVC, they would end up paying millions and millions of dollars in HEVC royalties that they weren't anticipating before HEVC Advance came out. So if you have any kids who are looking for work, tell them to go into law and become a patent attorney, because there's going to be all kinds of lawsuits coming from this in terms of the hardware and the software royalties. And then there's been a pretty chilling effect in a lot of different ways. This is all anecdotal. This is interesting, but it's not hard data. But I was speaking to a capture vendor, one of the big capture companies, and they're basically saying 4K services aren't talking about HEVC anymore. They're coming out with 4K, but they're not saying it's based on HEVC, and they're not allowing their vendors to announce the design wins. You can't, they couldn't say, somebody is using our HEVC encoder, because nobody wants to be on the record as using HEVC, because, I mean, it's not hard to figure out what they're using, but nobody wants to come right out and say it. I heard from a chip IP vendor that he's seeing a lot of interest in VP9 for the first time. So a lot of hardware vendors, a lot of content developers are saying, well, and we'll look at how VP9 compares to HEVC in a few seconds, but I asked him this question 6 months ago. It's like, anybody talking to you about VP9? Because I've been kind of banging the VP9 drum for 18 months now. And he said nobody. And now we spoke on another matter, and he said, we're starting to see a lot of interest in VP9 that's going to really manifest in terms of products and content in the next 6 to 12 months. And Microsoft added VP9 to Internet Explorer 11 Edge. So Microsoft and Apple were the big holdouts for VP9 in their browsers. And then Microsoft has added in VP9. So all of a sudden you've got, like, of all the new browsers, you've got pretty much everybody supporting VP9 playback except for Apple. And Joe Inzerillo, he runs where he's the technical lead for Major League Baseball. They've got their own streaming company. And his big deal was the notion of gross revenue. He's basically saying, we're not going to pay, this is a big deal. It's really taken the wind out of our interest in H.264 and 4K, or H.265 and 4K. And then this was kind of an interesting industry move, where in early September, some pretty significant companies launched what's called the Alliance for Open Media. So what they did is they merged together the codec technologies of Cisco, who had just announced a technology called Thor, Google with the VP9, VP10 technology, and Mozilla, who's been working on a codec called DALA for a few years. They merged that together into a next-gen codec that's supposed to ship in, I think, the end of 2016. And they've all agreed that all output's going to be royalty-free. So they're all giving away their IP because they want to promote, a free and open source codec in the browser space. Now, what's interesting, a couple things are interesting. Number one, Microsoft is in this group, which is why I'm sure they put VP9 in Edge, because now they're saying, well, this is the direction we're going in, we're going to jump in with both feet. What's also interesting is that Amazon and Netflix are in the group. So if you look forward and you anticipate a world where every smart TV is going to support VP9 or VP Next because YouTube's using it, and you've got Netflix who's shipping a ton of content, and Amazon as well, and they're saying, well, if I encode in HEVC, I pay 0.5%, and if I encode in VP9, it's free. They're going to start to move towards VP9 to the extent that's possible. So I think, from my perspective, last year it was, let's go. HEVC is really starting to make some inroads to, it really seems stalled at this point. Okay, so that's kind of the royalty situation. Where's the HEVC quality? We'll talk about what my test said, and we'll talk about the University of Moscow just said. And the expectation for HEVC has always been same quality as H.264 at 50% the data rate. So what I did a couple times now, I've updated this I think 3 times, is I took 3 files, one an animation, one a movie trailer. It was the Tears of Steel movie trailer, and then a real-world video test clip that I created, and then I encoded in VP9 and I encoded in HEVC, and then I compared the results. And I looked at two configurations, 720p and 1080p. So I didn't look at 4K at all, because I'm more interested in how much bandwidth will HEVC save in these pretty common bitstream types. And will it get to the 50%? And then I compared those files to H.264 encoded files. I compared the 720p at 4 megabits and 3 megabits just as a comparison point. And then I assessed quality with the Moscow University Video Quality Measurement Tool, which gives you an objective score for all the file formats. So what this tells us is, I guess these are mauve, but they're green in the spreadsheet. Anything green is where the quality of H.265 at 50% of the data rate was equal to or better than H.264 at twice the data rate. Okay, meaning in this column it's mission accomplished. In the animation it wasn't quite mission accomplished, but it was the same quality with only a 50% savings. Okay, so HEVC Advance in my tests delivered the goods. Most vendors claim the same quality between 30 and 50% depending on the resolution. So this is nothing new. Moscow University, has anybody heard of the Moscow University? They put out the big H.264 comparisons. They've been doing it for years. So they put out their first HEVC comparison in the last probably 6 weeks. And they did a whole lot more testing than I did. And it was pretty interesting. Oops. They encoded 20 test clips. They compared 8 HEVC codecs, including X.265, which is the HEVC codec that I tested. And they also compared to Google's VP9 and X.264. Now, for my comparisons, Google created the presets. And Multimedia Core created the X.265 preset. So I sent them some basic parameters. They sent me command line encoders, and that's how I created the files. University of Moscow did the same, except I think they're probably the world's best at X.264 encoding, and you'll see why that's important in a second. And they used PSNR and SSIM in their comparisons. They didn't use VQM, which is the metric that I used. But this is, one of their most basic findings was X.265 was the best HEVC encoder in their findings, and VP9 was second, only 6% behind HEVC. So there's been a lot of, when I put out my tests that basically kind of basically just kind of announced this, I put it out on the streaming media website, and I got a lot of heat from a lot of people. Some of it was pretty ugly. Basically saying I was a hack, and I didn't know what I was doing, and my results were flawed, and it was very interesting that University of Moscow came out and basically had the same results that I did. They're basically saying VP9 and HEVC are pretty equivalent quality. And then what was even more significant was they said that X.264 is only about 20% behind HEVC. So now we're looking at this environment where, HEVC costs a ton, it's the same quality as VP9, and it's not that much better than X.264. And that's just, it's almost like the Ronda Rousey fight, I mean, it's like, just bang it. And then these are my conclusions, the tests I did where I compared VP9 to HEVC. Here I used two different test tools. I used the Moscow University video quality measurement tool, and I used the SSIM Wave quality of experience monitor. And they concluded, here we saw that VP9 in my latest round of tests was about 9% behind X.265, and SQM found it less than 1% behind. So my tests were right along, pretty similar to what University of Moscow found. So why am I bringing up VP9 in this discussion about HEVC? Because if the quality wasn't similar, we wouldn't, if the quality wasn't close, we wouldn't be having this discussion. If it was the same quality as H.264, nobody would care. But now we've got to, freeze all is better, especially when you compare to a product where the price has gone crazy in the last 6 months. So where is this going to have an impact? I mean, I find it hard to think that it's going to have a significant impact in broadcast. But who knows? With the Alliance for Open Media, they're going to come out with different codecs. Maybe in 5 years, HEVC is totally, history. I don't know. But broadcast is very standards-oriented to a much greater degree than, as comparison, the browser. Right? Browser is free-form. Browser vendor can put any codec they want in there pretty simply. So I think in broadcast, it's probably not going to be relevant. In OTT, I think it's going to be interesting. We'll see where the numbers. There's going to be a lot of lawsuits about what's fair and reasonable for HEVC Advance, and we're going to see where those numbers kind of fall out. But until we know what those numbers look like, I mean, there's companies paying hundreds of millions of dollars under the proposed terms. Mobile, we'll see in a second. It could be relevant. Both the Android and the Apple platform now include HEVC. I don't know what Apple does when they look at the first check they have to send to HEVC Advance, and it's got 9 figures in it. So does really how much consumers don't care whether it's HEVC or VP9, right? I mean, my daughter, she got a new iPhone 6. It's got HEVC. She doesn't care. As long as the quality's the same, it's just not relevant to her. And then, interesting to think about the impact of the Moscow University report. I don't think it's going to slow market acceptance significantly, but I think a large part of that is, is HEVC Advance is doing that already. So my take is the quality issues aren't holding HEVC back. I think it's more just the business issues, the pricing issues that have come up. Any questions or comments? Anybody? Do we have a microphone or?
Yep.
One comment and one question. The comment is the reason for X264 being so close to X265 in the MSU test, as far as I understand, is that they normalized performance. That was my understanding. So if you look at some of the graphs there, they didn't fully normalize performance, but they divided it into bins. offline encoding 10 FPS and 30 FPS. So if you look at 30 FPS, real-time encoding, with X264 you can do it with very slow preset. But with X265, you need to use ultra-fast preset in order to get those 30 FPS. And then when you compare the bit rate, the difference is very small.
That's a good point, but I was showing the chart from the slowest test with no speed. Right. There was no speed.
Right, and that's 20%. In the other test, they even got to a difference of 6% because of normalizing performance.
Okay.
So that was the comment. The question is, are you sure that in VP9 there are no HEVC patent issues? Because I know the technology is quite similar.
And that's that's kind of the boogeyman, the other thing that everybody, and I don't, I just don't know, because it's, so the high level issue is, will the HEVC patent holders sue Google and the Alliance for Open Media? And I wrote an article about that, and we got some opinions from different people in the marketplace, and we don't know. But I mean, we heard the same, we've been hearing about that same issue since Google open sourced, VP8. So
yes, but in VP8 they licensed from MPEG-LA, I think.
Yeah, they did.
And they offered indemnification to anybody using it.
It was only 12, not all 13, and yeah. I mean, so there are still open HEVC patents that weren't licensed. And also, what the guys who I interviewed for the article said was, there's so many. They've got patents like cards, So it's like, oh, you want us to pay you for that? Well, you pay us for this. So just because there's a patent, and Google, when they bought Motorola, I think that's a possibility. I don't know. It certainly doesn't seem like it's going to slow. You've got Microsoft, Netflix, Amazon, Intel, Google, and Mozilla in the Alliance for Open Media, who are all developing based on that technology. So that speaks quite loudly about how they think they would prevail in terms of, in a patent lawsuit against the HEVC people. Any other questions or comments?
So if someone wanted to get licensing for content only, could they go to MPEG-LA and just get a license through MPEG-LA and be covered?
No, I mean, if you're gonna have to go through, every patent group will need separate licensing, and MPEG-LA doesn't have. Yeah, you can't get it from MPEG-LA because they don't have it. They don't charge for it. You have to. Everything is. You have to pay all groups. It's not like you just can license from one and that's it. You gotta. And H.264 was the same way. So there's, people who use H.264 in their encoders are writing 2 or 3 checks to different companies. So it's not all that surprising that it happened. What's surprising is how aggressive HEVC Advance has been with their pricing.
You also mentioned that HEVC IP, which is more hardware-based vendors such as Qualcomm and Broadcom, are they in top of the existing HEVC Advance? So we're talking about HEVC IP.
Right.
They charge on extra on top of HEVC Advance or different?
I'm sorry, I'm just not understanding.
Third group, the IP.
Okay, I don't know, but there's not a lot known about what they're going to do or when they're going to come out. It's really like the grassy knoll kind of thing, in the Kennedy assassination. I mean, it's all often talked about, but not a lot of people, not a lot of details are known.
All right.
Okay, so where, I spoke to several vendors. Where is HEVC taking off today? All the 4K television set implementations are HEVC, even though the vendors won't talk about it. And we're seeing HEVC in contribution for both broadcast and live streaming. So if I was live streaming this event, I might have an HEVC encoder because I can send out a 2 megabit per second stream that has the same quality as a H.264 stream at 4 megabits per second. And same thing for contribution anywhere in the broadcast space, anywhere that there's either a bandwidth limitation or a bandwidth costs a lot of money, HEVC is a great solution. It doesn't have to be for streaming. There's going to be a lot of pockets. There's going to be security applications and playback on airplanes and things like that before it ever makes it out into the big markets that we're talking about. So these are the markets that are selling now. What's new on the encoding side? This slide really probably didn't change that much from last year. All the traditional vendors now encode in HEVC, most of them in real time. Hardware and, obviously hardware is required most of the time for live. All the software vendors are now doing VOD. There's a new hardware architecture from Intel that's kind of and one of its uses is a codec coprocessor. And sorry, I put a slide in out of order, but this is the Intel VCA, or Visual Compute Accelerator, combined with H.265 software from Idiom is another, we're seeing this as a different live encoding architecture for HEVC. We're also seeing the first wave of smaller encoders. This is a product from Vitek that it's doing, and this is pretty interesting because it's doing 1920, it's doing 1080p maximum. It's not doing 4K. So they do a lot of military spec stuff. So it's hardened. It's got the metadata for surveillance cameras. So it's really targeted more towards that. But it's interesting that we're starting to see the first wave of smaller encoders. It's really big iron encoders up to this point. And then, in terms of where HEVC is going to take off, how do I see things unfolding in the desktop, mobile, and OTT smart TV markets? I think most of the current generations of PCs that we care about can, at the very least, play 720p. So these are playback tests, how much CPU is required to play back 720p H.264 as compared to HEVC. And, this Dell Precision is, I think it's like a 10-year-old computer, and for 720 it was around 40%. So these are pretty old computers that are playing 720p fine. You're not going to see a lot of 1080p on these computers, but again, these are very, very old. These are all before any of the dual-core current architectures. And then if you're on a typical notebook, this notebook's 5 years old, and even 1080p for HEVC was only at 21%. So I think HEVC will play on most computers you care about, certainly in 720p. The question is, how do you play it? So there's some software players. DivX 10 came out with HEVC in September of 2013. VLC Player came out in November. Both of those do a fine job decoding HEVC, but they're not installed on enough computers to really say, I'm going to roll out HEVC because you don't have general purpose decode. Flash, Adobe has announced that they're going to include HEVC decode in primetime, but not the general purpose Flash player. 25 million was too rich for their blood. They're not going to do for HEVC what they did for H.264 back in 2006. And they couldn't do it anyway because Flash is going away. So, it's a different market, different time. So the big problem in the browser space is there's no general purpose HEVC player. In terms of browser market share, these are the current versions of all browsers. So Chrome does not have HEVC. It's got VP9. IE 11 does not have HEVC. It does not have VP9. Edge has HEVC now, I think. VP9 is coming. Firefox, no and never will. Yes on VP9. And Safari, no and no. So VP9 gives you a lot more playback computers than HEVC does. And HEVC with an unlimited cap, it just makes no sense at all for any company to put it in a browser. I mean, it's a downloadable free product that you can't monetize for $1.20 or whatever the cost is. So if I want to use HEVC, if I'm Netflix or if I'm MGO or if I'm anybody distributing movies, I've got to pay for the player. And the player cost, I did a calculation, and MGO would have to run, they'd have to run a movie like 250 times to a particular user to pay the cost of that player. Looking at the savings they get from using HEVC as compared to H.264. So the economics of HEVC just don't seem to be compelling, particularly because VP9 is free and is very close to the same quality. So I don't see, anybody using HEVC in the computer space in the short term. Anybody have any thoughts on that? What about mobile? I think the installed base of mobile, software player only, I think that has battery issues. Using HEVC, this is a review in TechSpot where they basically said that playing back HEVC cut the battery life of tablets and phones by 50%. So I think there'll be a lot of resistance to using, that format in. People would rather use more disk space to get the same quality than lose battery life in most applications. Apple did add HEVC encode decode. Very curious, but they just did it for FaceTime. It's not available in the browser. You can't play HEVC video on your iPhone, even though the HEVC encode decode is there. So they're going to have to make a decision on whether or not they want to pay the royalty or just pull it. And, who knows? I mean, anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, it's 100, like I said, it's 120 million for just the iPhone 6. And it's hard to see that as being justifiable. Pardon? Yeah, but did they design it out? I mean, do they turn it off? Did they design it out is the big question. Google added software decoder and hooks to HEVC in Android 5. And there's some hardware-capable devices announced. All this came out before HEVC Advance was announced. It would cost Google $25 million. It didn't cost them hundreds of millions. And Google is a member of the Open Media Alliance. So they have skin in the game for this new generation codec. So what are they going to do? And I don't know. I mean, it's a lot. It's billions of dollars to their overall ecosystem if the royalty is actually held up in court. So in terms of today, HEVC it's in Apple. It's not being used fully. I'm not sure why, and it's in Android. And it is accessible to be used as much as you want it. So I think Android 5 is now around 30% penetration. So it's getting to be a significant number. And we're just going to have to wait and see what happens over the next few years because it's really going to cost them hundreds of millions, if not billions, if the royalties don't get changed. And then HEVC on OTT and smart TVs. These are the markets. These are the broadcast markets that I think HEVC is going to do really well in. HEVC is not on the new Apple TV, which is kind of a surprise or not. But I mean, Apple is in the HEVC patent group in MPEG LA. So you would think they would be very HEVC friendly. But they did not put HEVC in the new Apple TV. Even more surprising, given that it's in the new 4K Roku and the new Amazon Fire TV. So competitors are putting 4K HEVC-based playback in their competitive devices. All the smart TVs that are, all the current smart TVs have 4K playback. All the current smart TVs with 4K have HEVC, and all the relevant specs for hybrid TV in Europe and the Smart TV Alliance in the States, they anticipate HEVC in the devices. So, again, these platforms are very standard sensitive. They're also not that price sensitive. A browser is very different than a $500 TV. Add $1 to a $500 TV, it's not a big deal. Add $1 to a browser, and it's a huge deal. The question is, how much do you believe in UHD sales? The big issue I see with OTT, I mean, who here has a 4K TV set? Just you? You? Why are we not buying one yet? Why are you not buying one? HDR. So there are key standards for high dynamic range that are not set. Basically, if you buy a 4K TV set today, you're stupid according to CNET Don't take that personally. But yeah. So it's yeah, the TVs are stupid. And
Even though they're smart TVs.
yeah, even though it's I'll have to muddle over that one at lunch. But so I don't believe in the 4K market because I think the high dynamic range issue has to be set. And not that I'm, I wouldn't expect every buyer to be as informed on that issue as I am. But there's a lot of pretty techie. This is Huffington Post is bringing this out. So I think there's going to be the market's not going to take off until this issue is resolved. Not to mention the lack of content because nobody wants to create their content multiple times for when the HDR spec comes in. And then you also have deliverability issues. So, Netflix is 16 megabits per second for their 4K TV. They're telling you need 25 megabits per second. Akamai says the average in the States is around 11. The average in Canada is around 11 as well. So the average person doesn't have the bandwidth for it anyway. So I just don't believe in OTT until the HDR issue is settled, until bandwidth increases. But this is the market that's happening. Amazon's selling, everybody's doing 4K, and this is the market that's happening. Some of it's over managed networks, some of it's over the internet in general. But this is the place where it's thriving. But it's a lot of content going out, but it's a very small percentage of overall publishers using it. It's probably 50 to 100 publishers out of all the websites in the entire world. So it's a lot of content, small number of publishers using it. And then wanted to spend a little bit of time on how to produce HEVC and some of the things that I've seen. General concept is very much the same. This is an elemental white paper. You've got the basics that you've seen before, like intra prediction, the iframes. You've got iframes, B-frames, P-frames. Same thing with H.26. This is MPEG 2. This is H.264. This is H.265. So you've got the same frame sequence types. You've got similar transform, similar motion estimation with some advancements. But none of this stuff is going to be all that hard to figure out once you start encoding. Different encoders are going to present different quality versus speed trade-offs. This is from the elemental server VOD encoder. So you see all the typical H.264 parameters that you see or are familiar from H.264. And for HEVC, they have a 4-step trade-off between quality, which high quality is 0, and high density or more speed is 3. So these are the only way you can adjust HEVC encode options in the elemental encoder. And I think that's a good thing because you really can start going down the rabbit hole if you have more options to play with. With X.265, you can choose a preset. This is from the Telstream Vantage user interface. And a preset controls a range of parameters. And X.265 published this. This is basically the settings used for every preset in their command line encoder. So the big issue with preset always is how much quality and how much encoding time. And these are normalized results. So ultrafast is the fastest preset. It took 1.23% of the time it took for the highest quality preset, delivered 41% of the quality. And if you chart this out, this is the quality graph here. This is the time graph here. Medium is usually the default preset. So you see at medium, you're at 4% of the encoding time, and you're at about 83% of the quality. So you really can figure out, if you really need 100% or close to 100% as you can get, maybe you move up to the slow or the slower, but you start to see significant increases in encoding time to get that additional quality. Very different from X.264. X.264, you got 98% of the quality at this preset here. So it seems like the presets are doing a lot more effective stuff here than they were doing in X.264. Main concept uses the same thing. They use PQ values instead of presets. And then, here's average encoding time. Here's, and I did the same kind of graph here for, this is the quality, and this is the encoding time. And we see at PQ of 22, you've got still a very short encoding time, and you've got like 93% of the quality. So if you want to get more, you're going to start to see significantly higher encode times. So I mean, basically, it's H.265. It's not been a good year for it. I think the market conditions really got a lot more confusing. I think during that period, the encoding side has firmed up. I think the playback side has stalled, and that's kind of the important side. And I think 2016 is going to be a big year where we'll see some of the lawsuits that will figure out whether HEVC Advance, their terms will hold, and we'll also start to see if a third patent group is coming in. But it hasn't been a great year for HEVC. Any questions or comments? Or let me get you the microphone.
Regarding encoding, kind of a neophyte here, but are either those HEVC or VP9 available on Adobe's Creative Cloud? Premiere Pro.
Which?
Premiere Pro.
Premiere Pro, good question. There are plugins that let you access both of them. And if you Google my name, Premiere Pro, VP9, and HEVC, I wrote a blog post on it. So you'll be able to find out.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody using HEVC out there? What's your application? Pardon? Okay, just testing. Anybody else? Somebody else raise their hand. Anybody using VP9? Anybody using 4K? Why are you people here? What are you doing? Pardon? Okay. Say it again? Oh, right. I don't know. Good question. So is the GoPro 4K HEVC? I don't know, but that's a good question. Does anybody know? Okay, the presentation, the slides will be up on the Streaming Media website probably in the next couple of days. My website is Streaming Learning Center, so if you write that down, I'll put it up there by the end of the day today. Okay, we're done. Thanks for coming.